It's an effort that started about 4 years ago, where we felt there's been such extensive change in redevelopment in New Brunswick, and that the principals involved are getting older, that it's important for the historical record and also for our understanding and insights to have discussions. Okay, so we've had these good discussions and interviews with about 25 or so. You know, the quote unquote, the usual suspects.
The usual suspects.
In a good way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so one objective was that this thing needs to be memorialized while we can have these discussions. More broadly is to try to understand what happened and what's the takeaway. And in fact, you know, is this a good model or not? What could have been done differently with 20/20 hindsight?
Right.
And so we've gone from just having the discussions and memorializing it into wrapping this into a study that looks at almost in a split screen of the redevelopment in New Brunswick against the context of how cities have been redeveloped in the United States in the post-war period. It's hard to recreate history, and of course history is depending whom you're talking to. So one of the, and there's so many parts to this story, you know, what was going on at Rutgers, the hospital, but a very important component, you know, is the arts. So I'd like to share with you, can look at it another time, this is our write-up of the New Brunswick Cultural Center, and it's based on, we had a very extensive interview with Krebs. Okay, so in part, the writing is reflecting where we had more access with Tony Marquetta. Actually, Tony was a former student of mine. We just recently had the pleasure of talking to Jackie Rubel. So I will leave this with you.
All right, thank you.
I will send you an electronic copy as well. What I highlighted in yellow there was just where we had some discussions on Crossroads. And frankly, there isn't enough there. It's sort of because we haven't had the ability to have a good discussion. With someone like yourself. So with that, maybe part of this is how things happen. Maybe if you can talk a little about just yourself, you know, your interest, how you came to theater, and then how we came to New Brunswick. This is free-flowing. It's not like it's a Q&A by any means. If you would.
Yeah, my mother is from Philadelphia, and she went to Howard University to study in Washington, D.C. My father is from Trinidad, and he, on a ship through a storm, actually came to the United States to study, and he also studied at Howard. So they met there, and that's in Washington, D.C. is where I was born, at Freedman's Hospital. And then after that, of course, we moved around, and I remember being in Camden. We lived there most of my growing up. Camden, New Jersey. Yeah. Originally, we were in Norristown, Pennsylvania, on a farm, and I sometimes thought, my God, I grew up on a farm. But in reality, it was just about 1 or 2 years while my father was doing a residency there, and it just had that kind of impact, though.
He became a physician?
Yeah, he became a physician, and my mother was a nurse. And when we finally settled in Camden, New Jersey.
And this is roughly about when?
This was 60, somewhere around there, 60. And in fact, my father committed to Camden, although Camden's had its ups and downs. You know, when I was there, I remember the ups because Campbell Soup was there, and RCA was there, and so there was a lot happening. But I was also a kid, and to kids, you know, everything is good, right? We were on our block. There must have been hundreds of kids because we were all, you know, it was inner city, and we were all in row houses, and it was quite wonderful. Because we got to know everybody, and the community was actually in the street, you know, every night. Well, there was also a group that my parents put us in called the Jack and Jill. And the goal of the Jack and Jill, which is a national organization with many chapters, has been to provide a kind of cultural experience for African American youths that they may not necessarily get otherwise, especially those who were in the middle class, and the importance of us remembering our heritage, remembering our roots, but also playing a role in the American society. So one month we may go skiing, just because skiing should be an experience we have. One month it was to get on a bus and go to Broadway. And when we did, we were piled in this bus, we got to New York, it was like, wow, and then Broadway. And the play was Hello, Dolly. And of course there was no sense of why are we going to go to Hello, Dolly of all things, until we realized that it was an all-black cast. And it starred Pearl Bailey and Cab Calloway. And the big hit at the time was Louis Armstrong's Hello, Dolly. David Merrick was the producer who was the big-time producer of Broadway at the time. And of course, Hello, Dolly was a big hit because of Carol Channing and all of that. And then to do an all-black cast, and this is 1969, I'm thinking, wow, he must be crazy or amazing. One or the other, maybe both. But he had to realize what it, maybe he didn't, what it would mean to a kid to come to Broadway from a city like Camden, New Jersey, and look out there and on the other side of the lights, see people who look like you for the first time. That is probably the thing that had the most impact for me, you know, when it came to wanting to get into theater, starting theater. So from the get-go, for me, theater was about being able to present the images of people, not just black, but all people, so that they can see that that they can be that hero too. They can be that villain too if they want. They can be that person who is simply in love, or a part of a couple who wash their cars in the driveway on the weekends as well. These were not images that were out there for black people when I was going to college eventually. And Rutgers was my college. These were images out there. The images were negative. They were, you know, about just negativity. And if you saw black people on TV, most of the time it was on the news. You know, crimes and this sort of thing. You never saw the other side. But I remember what David Merrick did for me in Hello, Dolly, years and years before that. And I also remember leaving the theater and getting back on that bus to go back to Camden. And we're kids. And lo and behold, a couple of the cast members came out after the show and came onto our bus to say thank you. I mean, they said thank you. And that always stuck with me, because I realized then that in doing your work, there must always be a give and a give back. And as my mother and her colleagues used to say, each one reach one, each one teach one. And so these ideas that were planted in me from very, very young eventually led to my wanting very much to start my own company and do it in a way that.
So you're now in Rutgers, and what program?
Well, when I was at Rutgers, I was an undergrad was psychology, actually, because I love psychology.
In New Brunswick?
Yes.
Not in Camden?
No, this was College Avenue.
Yes.
And I went to, it was 1969 when I was a freshman. Now, understand, in my first year, my freshman year, they had just done Woodstock.
Yes.
That year was the year that man landed on the moon.
Yeah.
that was the year the Mets won a World Series.
Yeah.
I mean, so many. Love Story was on TV
Yeah,
for the
that's
first
right.
time, which
Right.
meant that all of the other, you know, if you were lucky enough to be with somebody you loved or somebody you were trying to woo,
Right.
on that night when it was on TV, chances are somebody was going to be on your arm crying. And this wasn't a
I
bad.
watched now when I was married to the theme song from Love Story.
Ah,
You know,
yes.
it's like, and now it-
And you never had to say you were
Absolutely.
sorry.
Now it's so sugary. What about it?
I know, but it was making people cry.
Yes,
It
yes,
was something.
yes,
It was
it was.
such a.
Yes, it was.
You know, there were other things that had happened in recent years before Rutgers, like the loss of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. But the years at Rutgers, I knew I wanted to do something. I didn't know that I was going to be committed to theater. So I studied architecture, and I even was considering transferring because I loved architecture and I loved theater, and I wanted to decide where to go to school based on that. So Rutgers was really to be there for 1 year and then transfer. So if it was architecture, maybe I'd go to like Syracuse or Carnegie Mellon or someplace like that where they had an architecture school. Or if it was theater, then maybe somewhere. But the fact that it was right there in New York excited me, that I could just hop on a bus and come to New York. I think that's why I ultimately stayed at Rutgers, even though my undergraduate went from architecture to pre-law, and then finally majoring in psychology. I figured, okay, I have a pretty full background, including the theater. The psychology, by the way, at that time had the most electives, a lot of electives.
Oh.
So all of my electives were theater.
Wow.
I should know this, but at the time, did Rutgers have any theater program? Or?
They did. They had a very small. Drama department. Is this okay?
Yeah, it's
I
fine.
turned the ear off.
That must have been, I mean, because Eric Krebs was asked to
Yes.
teach at Rutgers,
Yes.
early Livingston College, I thought.
Yeah, I didn't know Eric. Yes, that's not true. I did. I was when I went to Rutgers. I was. Yes, I was doing props for the shows. I was acting in the shows. I was actually doing a lot, but it was an undergraduate, and I think there were 4 majors at the time.
Oh, wow.
And it was located in the little theater on Nichols Avenue.
Right.
And that's essentially an all wood structure, pretty
Yeah.
incredible. But it reminded you of those old days. And
Yeah.
we did a lot of plays back then.
That building is still there.
Is it really? Oh. I love that place. I love the smell of it. But at that time, I also learned about Brett West
Oh, yeah.
in Brunswick. And
So that was when it was in Easton Avenue. I
Easton
guess it was in
Avenue.
Easton, then it was in Albany Street, then it was in the Acme Street.
I remember when it was on Albany Street,
Albany, right, okay.
just before it moved. Yeah.
So you would, what, attend some of the performances?
Mhm,
Were you
I
at-
did.
Were you part of some of those performances?
No, I was not.
So you were there, just taking it in?
I was taking it in. Anything I could do to take in theater, whether it was in New Brunswick or in New York, I wanted to do it. I didn't know that much about theater elsewhere in New Jersey, but I did know New Brunswick.
Did you see the performance with Al Pacino? Isn't that who he said? He had Al
Yeah.
Pacino in an early performance.
Did he really?
It was paid $50 in coffee.
Is that right? That one I didn't see.
I think
no.
that was when it was where the pharmacy building
Was
was,
it?
and the theater sat about 60 people.
It was Rutgers, it was whatever,
Yeah.
whatever.
It's amazing
So
how
getting,
time.
that was Krebs' recollection.
That was yeah. But I remember. I know we're skipping, but at Crossroads, I remember Denzel Washington coming and being there, and Denzel and I were standing outside of Crossroads in the old building, just standing out talking, waiting for some of the people in the show to come out, and then we're going to go out to eat. In fact, we went up to Panico's to eat, and Frank Panico was still alive, and he knew we were coming up. But it just to give you an idea, we then walked up the street. No one bothered us. That tells you how long ago it was.
Yeah.
Because otherwise,
What were your memories
Yeah.
of New Brunswick at that time, the city?
going back to college days,
Yes, that's.
you know, to be honest with you, I remember the campus buses, very old.
They're still with us.
Yeah, but no, those are very new now.
Right.
Oh, the
These
newer
were
ones,
very
yes.
old.
I
This was-
see.
These are very old buses, like the round ones, you know.
Yeah, I know.
I remember being told, if you're gonna go across to Douglas, or, you know, don't go in town, don't stop in town. They called the people who lived there townies.
Yeah.
And I do remember going a couple times, but I didn't see a problem. I just, you know, spent most of my time on the campus. It was also the first year. Livingston.
Which was true was basically Rutgers, it was in, but really almost not out of the country. It's like-
Right.
I guess so.
Right.
At that
I
time.
remember I was there not much, I was there in 1970.
Yeah. So that was an interesting time. I remember, you know, there were a couple X-rated movie theaters. I remember a restaurant that my folks loved, Lido Gardens, up what would be now up on top of, you know where La Fontana was? I don't
Yes.
know what's there now, but like up in that
Shaka
area.
burrito.
Shaka burrito.
It's a
Oh my
combination Hawaiian, Mexican.
God. Oh wow! I
They
remember
got
the
surfboards on the ceiling.
the singing sewing store. I remember that, and
Uh-huh.
close to the corner of Albany and George Street. These are things I do remember. There wasn't a built-up Easton Avenue or anything like that at
Right.
the time, but Rutgers was also all men.
Yeah.
I think later on we tried very hard to petition to get women there, and while that was going on, we were doing things like going across town Douglas and pulling the
Right.
fire alarm. So eventually they would have to come. If they're going to get a good night's sleep, they're going
Right.
to have to come to Rutgers. To Rutgers. Those were the kinds of things.
So you're in college and now you're taking in the theater that's there. You know.
I'm taking in the theater that's there. I was understand that from the time I saw Hello Dolly, I just loved. I breathed in theater. You know, it was in me because that was a very volatile time politically in the country. It was also a very interestingly divisive time. You know, if you were there was on radio there was the white stations and then there was the black station. You know, if you went into record stores, it was similar. They didn't call it R&B, it was soul. And, you know, it was always that Vietnam War was going on. The women's feminist movement was going on. The Black Panthers had come to play. There was Dr. King on one side and Malcolm X on the other. And even after Dr. King was assassinated and Malcolm was assassinated, there was still a sense of which to choose. You must choose. And even going back to LBJ and you know, there was the whole silent majority was considered to be the negative thing. So stand up for what you believe in. Tell us what you believe in. Don't sit on the fence. That was all what was going on at the time. That was all what was going on at the time. So you had to choose. And if it was not Vietnam and you were drafted, then it was you know, Canada. Everything was causing you to choose. When the national anthem was played at a baseball game, if you stood up, you were making a statement. If you sat down, you were making a statement. If you're running to a street, you're making a statement. If you're walking, you're making a statement. So everything was like that. And theater seemed to be this thing that calmed all the waters for me. I could close myself in and do plays that have really very little to do with my own life. It was just a fantasy world. That's what was happening. The first show I did when I was at Rutgers was in that little theater was The Hostage, an Irish play. Once we did Hello Dolly, saw Hello Dolly the years before, that same group, Jack and Jill, we said, okay, they said, let's do a play. Well, what do you think it was? It was Hello Dolly. And then after that it was My Fair Lady. And after that it was Sweet Charity and Oliver. And the point is that all of these are plays being done in the inner city, in Camden, by mainly black people, kids. This was all, for me, I guess, a way to be creatively not a part of all the madness that I saw going on. It didn't take it really, years later, did I start to see, wait a minute, there's a power in theater beyond just escapism. There's a power to the image. There's a power to the word. And there's a power when you bring people with many different backgrounds together, instead of turning a blind eye to color, instead seeing it as something quite beautiful. And then I became proactive about wanting to use theater to create a community of people that never exists normally, that come from all different backgrounds, racially, economically, age-wise, and they come, they see a play together. They may have different reactions, but they see it all together, and then they leave. If we did our job right, they leave just a little different than they were.
And were you always interested in directing as opposed to acting, or did you start with acting and then move into directing?
I always loved directing, and I loved acting. And I acted for a good long while. And my degree at Mason Gross, the MFA, it was a double. It was in acting and directing.
Okay.
And so it took me, I had to do double the work.
And that was a Rutgers.
That was at Mason Gross.
At Mason Gross.
And that was I was in the Mason Gross's first year. And
When Jack Bettenbender was dean?
he was my dean, he was my mentor, he was everything. He was a great visionary.
Yeah.
And he never saw things in a small way. It was always that. And that's what I loved. That's what I was excited about. I remember skipping into when Crossroads was first being looked at for when the relocations were going on. There was a building called the Sisser Brothers building on Livingston Avenue. And the thought was that it was a warehouse.
Right.
The thought was that that they would put Crossroads in the back of that. And I remember Jack standing up and saying, "No, Crossroads is not going to be in the back of anything." And I think that had a lot to do with why Crossroads now is in the new building on Livingston Avenue. But anyway, that's my point, is that when years later I realized the power of theater in a different way, to illuminate instead of allow people to escape. It was. And
you were also in this period where you're putting on acting some, directing some in the little theater.
Yes.
There were some other colleagues or others that.
Yes, there were, and I'm sorry, I realized your question was about the acting and the directing.
Yeah.
And the thing about the acting was that I loved acting, but I didn't want to be beholden to other people for me to do my work. I love directing because it connected me more organically to the visions that I want to put forth. And it was, the producing was because I never really had the experience of working for somebody else. Not when I was a little kid. My father was working for himself. My mother's father was a barber, and he had his own barber shop. My father's parents owned businesses in Trinidad, and it didn't matter how big or small it was. It was that I grew up just the whole notion if you want to do it, do yourself, do that kind of thing. So the people at Mason Gross School of the Arts at the time, there was Lee Richardson, there was Shirley Ralph, there was Bill Masters-Simone, Neil Cuthbert, Avery Brooks, Marilyn Rockefeller, and all of these folks were there to be a part of the forming of Mason Gross School of the Arts with Jack Bettender as the dean. I will say that there were rumblings at the time. We wanted more structure in the program. The program was very loose. It was trying to find its own way while we were paying tuition to be there. So we would always cause trouble all the time, but it was because we were itching to do something beyond what was happening at the moment. And so there were incredible achievers, overachievers, I guess you could say, in that program at the time. And there was also one way of doing things, and I wanted to explore other ways. So I remember Carol Rosenthal was the Rosenfeld. I'm sorry, Carol Rosenfeld was teaching acting at the time, and she was teaching one particular method. But I also wanted to learn other methods as well, more organic to my own culture, to the African ritual, that sort of thing. And they allowed me to also take classes at New Federal Theater in New York, under Woody King Jr. He's the producer there. They allowed me to take Black Theater Workshop class there, and for credit. So the one amazing thing that Mason Gross did was allow you to kind of mold it into what your own needs are. The other really great thing about Mason Gross at the time was that it was causing us frustration. We were itching to do something. It kind of prepared us for the real world. And we did our own work. There was a student organization called the Paul Robeson Ensemble, the Paul Robeson Black Arts Ensemble. And they actually started when I was an undergraduate, and I got involved with them then. And it was essentially actors from Rutgers, Livingston, and Douglas, and Cook. But the thing about it was that we had to do that kind of work on our own time. So we would be in classes all day. And then maybe during dinner, we'd grab somebody who was our scene partner for one of the classes and rehearse that scene. And then at 7, we'd go and start rehearsals for Romeo and Juliet or whatever the main stage was doing, either at the Little Theater or at Levitt Theater at the time. And then rehearsal was done by 11, and that's when we would start our rehearsal for Paul Robeson Black Arts Ensemble in the basement of Jameson. All of that just makes me tired now. But at that time, it's all we wanted to do. Yeah, and it's what we wanted to do. It was really, you talk about seize the moment. That, I think, is what Mason Gross School of the Arts was about.
So did you lead that group?
No. Let me think. When I was an undergraduate, a guy named Charlie Manning led that group. There was a time when Paris Collis, who is now a film writer, and he also was inducted in the Distinguished Alumni, Hall of Distinguished Alumni. He was running it. I don't remember who was running it after that. I just knew that we were all involved.
So you acted in it?
Oh, acting. Did the lighting sometimes. I did the sound sometimes. I never directed. I did those things, but I was directing elsewhere. And then when I was in, and David Margulies was also, he was the directing teacher at the time. Now he's a big-time actor. But David was teaching directing. Joe Hart also
Right.
was a directing teacher.
Now, is it about this time when you approached Krebs about starting Crossroads, or is that?
No, it was after graduating.
So you finished the MFA?
Finished the MFA, went out and started auditioning, and I think that was when I realized, my God, all these roles were for pimps and prostitutes. Aren't there any substantial roles? And I wasn't thinking as much about the image being portrayed. I was thinking about, wait, I went through 4.5 years of postgraduate training, and this is what I'm being asked to do. That was an eye-opener. But also, I had heard about a program called Comprehensive Employment and Training Act,
Right.
CEDO. And I heard about that, and it was Jackie Rubel who was running the program for the Middlesex County Arts Council. And at that time, Estelle Hassenberg was running a similar program for the Middlesex County Cultural and Heritage Commission. It was interesting. They were both CEDA programs, and both very similarly were hiring about 10 artists of different disciplines to just make themselves available to the community throughout Middlesex County. And because the two had similar designs, and everything back then was political too, I guess just like it is now, they divided up the territory. So we knew who we could go, who we needed to go to
Right.
in the county, and who couldn't. We did everything. We did shows all over the playgrounds and churches and synagogues and schools. And the two actors in the program, well, there were three, but Lee Richardson and I we got into this. I heard about it. I told Lee, I said, Lee, let's go and interview. And we got the job, and it was a whole year's salary. It was amazing to be an actor coming out of school and you get this. That's what it was. And we were in this program, and we started doing plays all over the place. And then towards the end of it, we started doing this play called Zizwe Bansi is Dead, from South Africa. And apartheid was still going on at the time, so there were a lot of protests. And this particular play was a protest play written by Apple Fugard, Winston Tishona, and Johnny Crockett, all from South Africa. We loved doing that play. We loved it. We took it everywhere. I had the set in my trunk on my back of my car. Actually, come to think of it, we had done that play, Lee and I, in graduate school at the time. So this was about putting it back out there. Let's do it. And throughout the year, we really loved the idea of doing this and being part of the struggle. But then the program came to an end, and that's when we approached Eric Krebs to say, look, you have this George C. Playhouse, this is happening right now.
That's roughly about when you approached Krebs.
This was in 77.
We had the pleasure of attending in Crossroads when you had, I guess it was earlier this
The
year.
Founders Day.
The Founders
Oh, the
Day.
Just in
Founders
the
Day.
spring.
Yes.
There was
Oh, it's
having a
another
sen-
woman,
having
yeah.
a senior moment. There was a
Yeah.
woman who was involved.
Louise
Louise.
Gorham. Yeah, Louise Gorham. The great thing about let me back up a second. When we approached Eric,
Yes.
it was Lee and I
Yes.
had an idea.
Yes.
And it was simply as actors,
Wow.
let's
Wow.
do Zizwe Bansi is Dead. Eric said he would love to, but there's no audience out there for it. And so that was like amazing to us. How could there not be an audience? So the thought was, well, then why not create the audience? But he was not ready to do that at the
Yeah.
time. There was an undergraduate fellow student of mine who, I'm having a senior moment now, I'm trying to remember his name, I'll remember it, but he, by that time, was in CETA and working for CETA. And he said, well, Rick, there's this program. It's the same program like the one that you were in Middlesex County, but if you apply, you can get money to start this company you want to start, but you have to be a 501c3, and we weren't. So I went back to Eric and said, look, can you don't think that there's an audience out there, let me prove to you that there is. And we don't want a dime of your money, we can bring it all ourselves. He said, okay. So we, they did up the application. Lee and I were at lunch one day at Sir John's,
Oh, yeah.
or Sir John's, which is now something.
Lego.
Lego, yes, yes. And we sat down, and on a napkin, I wrote out the mission. We said, okay, what is our mission? We figured it out right there at the table. And that on that napkin was the mission. So we took the mission, we took the program design, we built it into an application, and we got the funds. And at that point, we were able to hire, I think, a total of 12 people. So half of them were actors, would be for actors. We figured one would be a house manager, one would be a stage manager, one would be publicity, one would be administration.
And that's roughly the 76, 77.
Now we're in 77.
Now we're in 77, okay.
Now we're in, I'm sorry, no, now we're in 78.
78, right.
And when we got the money, that's when we then brought in Louise Gorham, Kenny Johnson.
She was administrative?
Louise was, I think she was, it was one of those things where everybody had to have a slot, but then
Yeah.
Right.
once you got in there, you did
Everyone
everything.
everything, yeah.
Louise
Yeah. Louise
Gorham?
was an actor.
Yeah.
Louise Gorham, yes.
Gorham, okay.
Yes, Gorham, Louise Gorham.
Okay.
There was Kenny Johnson. He came in as a stage manager, but then did other things. Gary Bingo Johnson. He came in as maybe the house manager or something. There were just a bunch of, and it was Maureen Heffernan came in as
Why is
the
her name
administrator.
familiar?
Yeah, she's in Middlesex County. So.
And was that when Memorial Parkway?
Yes, that's when we started. Well, actually, we didn't.
What?
What happened was when we knew we were gonna. This grant was gonna come through. We knew in, let's see, maybe September that it's approved and it's gonna come through. Now it was official, and we had told other people, listen, this is gonna happen. You gotta be around. You want to do this. So. Probably once around that time while we were gathering people, we were also trying to figure out where this thing was going to be.
Yeah.
And we went all around, and then finally we found 320 Memorial Parkway. We looked at a place on Church Street called Roselle's. There was a shoe store, I think.
Oh, okay.
So we were looking, and they were wanting to rent it out. I thought it was a perfect location. But there were limits, and we didn't know the landlord that way. We also looked at a bunch of other places. And I was in
All in New Brunswick.
all in New Brunswick, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, New Brunswick was where we wanted to do it. And I remember I was acting in a play up in Springfield, Massachusetts, Raisin in the Sun. Hal Scott was the director. And it was my first real gig coming out of school as an actor. I was there up in Springfield when Lee calls and says, Rick, I found the perfect place, That was the 320 Memorial Parkway. And when I saw it, I saw why he said that. For one thing, the ceilings were very high. It was an old sewing factory.
And was this a loft
It was a loft.
or a whole floor?
It was set up as a loft on all 3 floors. On the first floor,
Was Tony Nelson living
Tony
there?
Nelson was on the third floor.
Third floor,
Yeah.
right. So I remember, I knew Tony.
Yeah, you knew Tony.
Yeah.
Tony Nelson and his family were on the third floor, with the exception of the very back. The back was Rob Schneider.
Who owned J.
Who owned
August
J. August
Cafe.
Yeah, that's right.
On
And
the
was a
second,
student,
Was
taught
a
an
student, a
MCRP.
student among
Is that
them.
right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
on the
With
second,
his dog.
the second floor was the one that was vacant,
Mhm.
except for the very back.
Uh-huh.
And that was where Jim Black lived,
Hmm.
from the Frog and the Heat.
Right.
Yeah.
And on the first floor was the Rask Auto Parts store. And adjacent to our building was
And you-
John's
you-
Bargains.
I remember John.
Yes.
And you were on what floor? I should.
Second.
The second.
Yeah, the one that was available was most of the second floor.
So when you had the theater, Jim Black remained living there in the back?
They all lived there.
Oh, okay.
Jim Black was our landlord,
I see.
you see, and he was the official landlord.
So
And
he owned the building?
He owned the building.
I see.
And so it was wonderful, because not only did they let us do our thing, but they loved the thing we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like one family, that's how I looked at it. It's just one big family. When we would do shows, I remember one time we did a play called For Color Girls,
Mhm.
considered Suicide with Rainbows Around.
Mhm.
And we opened that night, and I remember in the middle of it, Tony Nelson saying to me, "The reception going to be with us?" He said, "Well, it's right here in this little space, about the size of this room." He said, no, we could do it upstairs. Let's have everybody come upstairs. And there was a fire escape that took you upstairs in the back. So we said, okay. By the time that show finished, he and his wife had a whole spread set up for us. It was really amazing. And so those were the kinds of things that would happen. And then the next day, came into work, and there was a garage door next to our entrance, painted. Tony had painted it for Color Girls. You know, he just wanted everybody to know. The street was painted.
Wow.
It was that kind of exuberance that kept us going, even though there were low points too. Those were
Do
great.
you recall the first production you put on in Memorial Park?
The first one, yes. When we Dan Irvin, by the way, Dan Irvin was also one of the original people from Rutgers. We were all from Rutgers, and so one of the good things was that we all shared a common language, in terms of the craft. And Dan was. We didn't have a name for the thing. It was called we had to call it the Ethnic Theater Project, right? Because we couldn't use anything other than that, because it was a CETA program. But we didn't have a name, and we were thinking about the name. What name? And prior to even opening, before that first show, we wanted, based on our mission, we wanted to make sure that we could break barriers down between the traditional theater audience, which is white, and the non-traditional theater and the theater, as well as the non-traditional theater going audience, which is primarily black and Latino, and the theater. So in order to do those things, before we even started our first show, we all conducted workshops. We took it out into the streets, just like we had learned to do the year before. We went to churches and senior citizens' homes and synagogues and schools, just to say this is who we are, but also to help them. So we taught Tai Chi, and we taught acting, and we taught how to build a model, a set model, music, trombone, all sorts of stuff, and trumpet. And one day, Dan Irvin is on a ladder scraping a wall, and he's looking out the window, and he sees all these streets coming together and being built, and it just hit him Crossroads. And all of a sudden, it just made total sense, because on so many levels, that was our mission. That's where our name came from. So by the time we got to our first play, we had already done about 2 months of workshops and this and that all over the place. It was called First Breeze of Summer by Leslie Lee. And we did not charge. We didn't charge anything for the plays back then. All you had to do was just sign out. The second play we did was...
Did you just have folding chairs in there?
No, we didn't. Eric Krebs, that first year, they weren't folding chairs, but they were pretty dilapidated. We found them wherever we could. Rutgers surplus. That's where we
Yes,
got them.
material services,
That's right.
right?
Yeah, that's where we got our first chairs,
Yeah.
and we had 60 seats, 60 in there, and we moved them around depending on the show. You know, it wasn't any one area.
And this is 78, 79?
78, 79 was the first CETA project. It lasted a year. It was also pretty evident to me, again, this was going back to me not ever wanting to work for anybody, wanted to do it ourselves. It was evident to me that we had potential here. And rather than being a project, I wanted it to be a real thing. Rather than it being under George Street Playhouse, I wanted it to be ours. And so around the middle of that first year, I contacted Roy Epps. And I remember Lee and I went to Roy's office. And Roy said, well, if you're really serious about this, what you need is a board. I said, okay. And then he said, I'll pull it together for you, just a group of people who can meet as a committee. And that group came together. That was Penelope Latimer was there. At that time, she was the assistant superintendent of schools in Brunswick. There was Cheryl Wall. Dr. Wall was English professor.
English department.
Right. There was a businessman, Jim Jones, from South Brunswick. There was from Johnson & Johnson. I can't remember his name, but he was
John
Bob
Campbell?
Bob Andrews.
Bob Andrews?
Bob Andrews was the, he was in the PR there. And Bob Andrews was, they were all great. Then I went to Ronald Wright, the attorney. He's a judge now in Brunswick. And I said, Ronnie, we need to incorporate. And he said, well, if you're going to incorporate, I'll incorporate you. I'll do it for free. But you need a good accountant. And right below him in that building was Joseph Spack. And Joe Spack became my first accountant and taught me how to do the one right system of checks, where everything was in hand, but it was like a carbon underneath. So when you wrote it out, not only did the amount and name come on, but also the category. So it was really great, and I learned accounting that way. And our books, the first books that I kept for the first 5 years are still in our storage, archives. Anyway, that was kind of how things started to come about, so that by the time the CETA program was ending, we were ready to do our own thing. But what we did was we went ahead and did a second year. So the first year began in November and ended in around November. The second project from CETA started in January of 1980. And that went, I think we just did that for 6 months or something like that. We just wanted to get it going. But during that year, the goal was really to start to get people in the habit of paying to come. It also gave us the opportunity to start to cultivate interest from foundations, corporations. Because keep in mind, we didn't need the money. We had CETA money. But my goal was that by the time CETA finished, and we were going from CETA and George C. Playhouse,
Yeah.
we would have our own everything. And that's basically how it happened.
Now, during this time, J&J had already made plans to stay and build their headquarters.
J&J had already decided, yes.
And the Hyatt must have been built.
No, no.
Not yet? Okay.
No, nothing
That was
was
82
there.
maybe or something.
Yeah, I do remember very early on hearing plans.
Yes.
And those plans included the demolishing of that building.
Yeah.
Now,
Were
that
you in-
means that New Brunswick tomorrow, they were the ones in charge of the plans,
Right.
had already been established, which means that J&J had made the decision to stay
Right.
probably a few years before.
So, were you at the meeting when Tony Nelson proposed an alternative to Dick Sellers to keep the older buildings in Hiram?
I wasn't there,
Oh.
but I heard about it. And I don't know all that happened after that, but you see, I knew that something was going to eventually happen in that area, and I wanted them, everybody.
Because the area was slated to be redeveloped.
Yes, and we didn't know quite what that meant, but what I did know, I know the power of image, and I wanted to renovate the theater, make it look really good, thinking that if it looks really good, that's what they got to give us if they move us.
Right.
We also started a petition. I started a petition for signatures to keep Crossroads, keep Crossroads. By the time we got to 1982, now we're about 4 years old, maybe 1981, 3 years old. By that time, enough steam was building for Crossroads that they had to do something. They couldn't just. I mean, this was a role model for CETA. This was a success story.
Yeah.
When there were so many government programs that weren't successes at all, this was a huge success. And now we're out on our own. I remember incorporating a second company called Crossroads Productions because I knew that CETA they didn't want to buy anything. They wanted to rent everything because it's temporary. So I thought, okay, if I could get a company to buy the lighting equipment and sound equipment and all of that, and the chairs, and rent it to the Crossroads,
I see.
project for the same amount, we would end up with the equipment we need to then go, and that's what we did.
So with some of the players, J&J in this period,
Yeah.
so you had a J&J executive on your board, anything more than that, as far as?
Sure. When we renovated, by that time, somebody had moved out of the back, so we were able to take over. Where did Jim Black go? He went somewhere, I don't know. We ended up taking over the whole second floor. Yeah.
Well, did he live above the restaurant?
There was no restaurant at that time.
Okay.
Jim Black.
Yeah.
No, there was no restaurant. And Hubbard was not J. August at the time, it was Catalyst on Church Street. And so what happened was and Rask Auto Parts store closed down. So we were able to convince them to let us have the whole second floor. This is, this time, Johnson & Johnson, because Johnson & Johnson that's
Own
right.
the real estate.
That's right.
And did they contribute monies to help you expand?
Yes, they did. They did. And not expand in terms of in there, but program money they did.
And that allowed you to go from how many seats to how many seats?
60 to 120.
60.
And at that time, now getting back to the Dick Sellers meeting, let me think. From what I understand, when Tony Nelson proposed an alternate plan, it was in order to keep the building standing. So we were all for that, of course. But Dick Sellers, I know, had his own thoughts, and it was clear that it was going to be knocked down. That's why Tony then said, okay, we're going to have it declared a landmark. So it's declared a landmark. So they couldn't knock it down. So then it was like, well, if we're not going to knock it down, we're going to force you to sell it. Well, you can't force us to sell it. Well, yeah, we condemn it. So it was all of that going on, you know, that we were hearing about. And the upshot of all of that was that there were settlements. And the result of the settlement with Jim Black was the Frog and the Peach, or led to, I should say, the Frog and the Peach. The settlement after Hubbard left, it was J. August Cafe. And Tony Nelson, they had relocated out to...
He was out in Somerset.
That's right, a beautiful
On a farm,
place.
right?
Yeah, and in fact, when I went out there, it was the first time I ever saw a black pool, swimming pool. It was pretty cool, and he had fish and everything, it was great.
I remember telling Tony, it really changed, you know, you went from the loft,
Yeah.
it was
Yes,
an
yeah.
urban, to this colonial house.
Yeah.
He did to a colonial house.
So,
Yes.
so I'm just trying to think geographically. So were those two restaurants on the back side of where Crossroads was?
No, if Crossroads was here facing Memorial Parkway.
Right.
You went this way and you had John's store.
Yes.
Bargains, right?
Yeah.
And then if you turned at John's, you had Manny's Den.
Okay.
Then if you turned again, you had Frog and the Peach, and then.
Okay, so it took about 2 blocks in
Yeah.
of buildings. Okay.
Absolutely, and it was a pretty great neighborhood. When
Yeah.
you think about it, there was so much diversity there. Yes, there was glass on the sidewalks. and
Yeah.
all that, but by that time, Bob Andrews had to leave J&J. And the reason he left was because he was the one sent out. I remember I had a meeting with him at his office one morning, set up at Johnson & Johnson. And on my way, the secretary calls and says, it's canceled. He has to go out of town. And I watched the helicopter leave and took him because he was the one they sent to Chicago to handle the Tylenol crisis. And he was brilliant. And then, of course, as a result of that, they promoted him, and then we lost him. But the person who came in after him was Gary Garand. Gary Garand became our treasurer, but he worked
Also with J&J.
also at J&J and worked very closely under John Heldridge. So that's how John Heldridge started to know more and more about Crossroads through
Right.
Gary. And just the support for what we were doing, I'm not talking just financial, just kept on increasing because of it. And
From J&J.
from J&J, and as a result of right after the renovations, once again, Roy Epps comes in the picture. And I said, Roy, I want to get more business people involved. He said, well, then let's have a business night. And he convinced John Heldridge to do a night at Crossroads with a reception at the Hyatt next door. That was, because by that time they built the Hyatt. And it was about Crossroads. And it's interesting because the play was brothers, it was Ethel Fugard. It was an anti-apartheid.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but the point is that
But it was just coincidental, that was the play.
It was just
Business
coincidental.
Right.
And it was interesting because here Johnson & Johnson was just committed to keeping their funds in South Africa.
Yeah.
And every time they had an annual meeting, there were protests.
Yeah.
And I remember that.
That was when Ed Blaustein was arrested in New York.
Ed Blaustein, that's right. Ed Blaustein gave our first benefit for Crossroads at his house.
Oh, really?
Yes. And we had just done Paul Robeson. Avery Brooks was in it, and Ernie Scott.
Oh.
And he had the benefit, and I guess that was somewhere around, that was the early '80s also. And so Ernie and Avery came, and they did a little number from the show and all of this. It was very nice. But Ed Blaustein and his wife were such incredible hosts,
Yeah.
and told us the story about Paul Robeson was there at the house. A lot of great support in those
Any
days.
other
coming from all over.
Rutgers connection or support?
No,
Was Mason Gross at all? You know,
No,
the
not
program
at
at
all.
all? with
not except for Jack Battenman.
Did you know Kenneth Wheeler? Who was the provost
I
and who
don't.
supported arts?
I don't think I ever met him.
So there was
I think
some
so.
of this mainly through Blaustein, some,
Yeah.
support.
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly Jack Bender was a lightning rod for that, and he made things happen. But yeah, Ed Blaustein and his wife became opening night subscribers, and they would come to all the shows. They did this this benefit. The second benefit we did the following year, we decided to do Robeson, and they gave us Nicholas Music Center. Nicholas or Nichols Music Center?
Nichols.
Nichols Music Center.
Nicholas Music Center.
And so we did Robeson there, and then for the reception walked over to Eagleton and did the reception there. So there was always a great deal of support from
Right.
Rutgers.
And the city, John Lynch in the city, were they not there?
Okay, so-
against,
Here's the thing, with the city, the city was always there for us. And mid-'80s, we were having a pretty severe problem with parking, because what was happening was there was a lot, and it was documented in the papers a lot, but there was a lot there. By this time, John's was closed down, but there was a lot across from John's, across that little street. And when people would come, our patrons, they'd have to find parking on the street wherever they could. There was not a lot or anything. But then there was this little lot, and no one was ever there at night. So they would park in that lot. There was a little sign about this big saying "Don't park." That big. They were getting towed. People were getting towed every night, and we couldn't figure out what was going on until what happened. They had found out was that a guy who was a cousin or somebody of a policeman who would call the guy and say, "Okay, look, there's this number of cars there." He would then tow and charge something like $60 for the tow. And I mean, that was back then. It was incredible. And it got to be a really big thing. So every now and then I would have a meeting with John Lynch in his office, and John says, "How can I help you?" And I said, "We got a problem with towing and getting people towed. I don't know what to do." He said, "Seriously?" I said, "Yeah." Picks up his phone and he calls somebody and says, "When are we planning to demolish John's?" "Okay, let's do it now." They demolished John's,
Wow.
paved the lot, and put up a really beautiful fence around it.
Wow.
So, yeah, New Brunswick.
Did John Lynch ever attend any of your?
Yes, oh
events?
yes.
He did?
Absolutely.
He was
there.
there.
He was there. He was there. He also started a commission, the Brunswick Arts Commission.
Right.
And the goal of that was to try to figure out, you have all these arts organizations, what are we going to do with them? And the commission was made up of, Eric was put on the commission, I was put on the commission, Jack Bender was put on the commission, Bill Wright
Oh, yeah.
had planning, right, at Rutgers was put on the commission. There were a few others as well. And the result of our study at the end of that year was that we should bring everybody together into a cultural center. And Bill started developing And that's how it started to happen. After that, then they incorporated Brunswick Cultural Center, but even when they were looking for their first president, they contacted us, the commission, and we were able to interview the people that they liked. And, you know, so it was a really nice
And who was the
relationship.
first cultural center president? Was it Bill Wright?
It might have been Bill Wright in the beginning.
And Ginny Brackert, maybe?
I can't remember the first one. I remember we interviewed people. I think that there was a first person, and then it was Bill Wright.
Okay.
Came in under.
Was
I
it the
honestly
guy,
don't know.
David, what's his name, who was head of the
No.
State Theater?
He was later. It was much later.
Okay.
He was much later. I honestly can't remember the first.
But you were still down on
Maybe it
Memorial
was Bill
Park?
Park.
Wright until they
I
found
think
him.
so.
So the
We were
cul-
definitely-
You were still in the, on
Oh,
the
yes.
Memorial Parkway?
Absolutely.
So when Lynch called and said, when are we taking down John's, how much longer did it take before your building was then demolished?
Before it was demolished.
Or before you had to move?
We were in our new building we moved into the building in the fall of 1991.
Oh, okay.
where you're currently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Currently. So.
Any sort of thoughts on, well, the building didn't just happen, you know, like.
Oh, well, you know, they were very good to us in that, around that time, keep in mind that the question was what to do about Crossroads. We gotta move them, what do we do about it?
Right.
The first thought was the back of the Sisser Brothers building.
Mm-hmm.
Roy Epps then had taken me to another place that was on Carroll Street, and we also looked at the food town there. You know,
Mhm.
we looked at a bunch of different places, but then at that time there was a very narrow where Crossroads is now. There was something there that was taken down.
Yeah.
And so now it was this little narrow area. And I looked at it and I said, wow, there's that lot there. And the optometrist was right next to it, and they were going to knock that down. And I was, well, if they're going to do that, there's going to be a space there. And Roy says to me, okay, well, look, be quiet about it. Let's talk about this. Because for the city to build a new building for Crossroads and not do that for George Street, who was by that time in the Y, there may be political, things to it. So let's keep it quiet, but let's look at other ways to do it. And we looked at the grade of the street and realized that as the grade changes, it's not straight between that lot and Crossroads. So what I had proposed was that George Street and Crossroads share, or somebody had proposed that we share the same lobby. What Roy was saying, they're going to find out later on they can't because of the grade. And it then became a lot easier for them to just build a whole new building. And that's essentially.
So just an aside, I think that's Egyptian revival, the style of the building.
Kinda, I had an affinity to pyramids and
Okay, this is clear, it's.
the columns.
Yeah.
The architect, Vincent Myers, was the architect, a firm from Princeton. And we also wanted to make sure, even though we interviewed many architects, wanted to make sure that the architects of color had a chance in there. And he happened to win. It's an African-American firm. Myers and his, is that me?
I think so.
Yeah, can I do?
Sure.
Or actually, do you want to just grab that? That'd be easier. Oh, they have it, okay, it's okay.
All right.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
No.
Yeah, that's right.
Next time I'll be quicker.
Okay.
So just a little aside, we also interviewed David Harris as part of the series of.
Oh, David Harris, yes.
And he said his story about the Sellers-Nelson confrontation, that Tony presented a plan, you know, for preserving
Right.
Hiram district area, and that Dick Sellers said something to the effect of, I have money to do a plan, and the only plan I can pay for is my plan. So that was it.
Oh, boy.
He said he felt so sorry for Tony because he was so enthusiastic about it.
Well, one thing I
Yeah.
knew about Dick Sellers was that he knew what he wanted and it
Yeah.
was going to be that way.
Yeah.
John Heldrich, who was really the person to push so much of the redevelopment, actually became a good friend of Crossroads. And in fact, there were times when he's come up and offered to help me and mentor me with the business end and stuff. They were always concerned about the business end
Right.
of Crossroads because I'm an artist, I'm an artistic director, and we never, I found a way to keep the place surviving for 20 years, just like Eric Krebs does, but you don't necessarily do it the way people want you to do it.
So
Right.
you went from, I guess, the 120 seat in Memorial Parkway to now you're
320.
320.
320, and we so Vincent Myers was the architect, but then they brought in another architectural firm from New York to do the interior design, because it was clearly too big a project for Vincent to handle at that time. So they helped with the interior. There was also another group that helped us learn, and be able to articulate what it was we wanted and needed in the building. And with that group, I learned about what makes Crossroads tick and how that translates into physicality. So one of the things, so what's very similar between the old space and the new is that the way we worked and the proximity to the art and the rehearsal hall and all of that is basically the same. In the old building, you come in, you go up steps, and there's the theater. And you go up to the upper level, and there are the offices. There's the common room up there. And then if you go all the way to the back of the third floor is the rehearsal hall. And if you go down from there, you get to the dressing rooms and then the backstage. Exactly the same way. That all of that was exactly the same, just bigger.
And actually, with your new venue, were you changing artistically? You now have a much bigger house.
We have a bigger house. Our audience they were so committed, saying, please don't get rid of the intimacy. Don't get rid of the intimacy. And one of the things I did was I went just to colleagues to try to find out what creates intimacy. We go into many different theaters, what creates intimacy? And one of the things I found, I was actually at Lincoln Center, and a friend of mine, Gregory Mosher, was the head of Lincoln Center Theater at the time, and he sat with me in the Mitzi Newhouse Theater. We just looked and felt it, and thought, what is it about this? And it wasn't just that the audience wrapped around. It was that the audience was always aware of the audience. And that is what creates intimacy. The audience's awareness with itself, seeing other people respond to what's in the middle there. So that had a lot to do with it artistically. The other is, and it also gets back to the whole Egyptian thing. I always believed that there should be one way in and one way out. So, and that there should be a bit of a journey to whatever that space is. And that it be in some way circular. So when you come into the new building now, you have to go up the stairs.
Yes.
Originally they were curved going up they were changed to angular, which is cool, and then it goes up. But then you come into this space that's the lobby, and then there's one entrance.
Right.
One entrance in.
Right.
And that has a lot to do with just trying to, include that concept in the experience that the audience would have.
All right, so then we're now in the new house and, you're playing to a larger audience.
Yeah.
You want to just take us a little closer and say,
Yeah, well, it also took a long time. The groundbreaking of that space, I have to check it, but I'm trying to remember when that was, but I could figure it out, but it was quite a long time before we actually moved in.
88 maybe, or 89?
It was in there somewhere, and yeah, I think it was, actually, it was. And the groundbreaking happened, everybody was happy, and then nothing happened. And then Penny Latimer, who was the president at the time, said, well, can you at least put a sign up there? So they got a sign up there, saying future home of. But there was a long time that nothing was.
So the
nothing.
city paid for it or the county?
Well, I think it was mainly the county.
Okay.
I think it was mainly the county. There were also funds raised, with Crossroads'
Bonds?
name on it, but those funds, I think, went to other places because I believe it was primarily the county funds that paid for it.
Yeah.
And finally, they started to build, and when they would build, I used to have pictures, but finally, when they started to build, they were mainly building what looked like an outdoor Greek amphitheater. So the staff, we would sneak up there in the middle of the night sometimes after a show and go out there and just look. And the way the moon hit the cement was incredible. The stage, the seating risers are all cement. So they were all laid in that foundation.
Right.
They didn't excavate.
Yeah.
It was just right there. So it really looked like a nice amphitheater. We were out there a lot, had good times with candles, wine. But it took a long time. It was in the spring of '91 that whoever was answering the phone sent this message to me, Rick. Bill Cosby wants to talk to you. And I'm thinking, right, yeah, sure. So I picked up the phone thinking, okay, who was this giving a joke? And there was a guy who says, Ricardo Khan, said, yeah, Mr. Cosby would like to talk to you. And then I started realizing maybe this is serious. And he said, okay, this is the number. He's in Las Vegas. He's expecting your call. So I called him, and of course, he's into his all the time. And all the years prior to that, we had tried to get Bill Cosby or somebody to do our benefits. We never could. But we were lucky with Bill Wright. You know what? He must have been the first president of the Cultural Center.
I think so.
Because he called me one day and he said, for your benefit, Rick, listen, we can negotiate Ray Charles to come in and do your benefit. Do you want to do it? You just pay the expenses, keep the money. I said, yeah. So we did Ray Charles. After that, we did Smokey Robinson. After that, we did Wynton Marsalis. We did a number of things with Bill Wright there. It was really great. But we can never, Dionne Warwick, we can never get Cosby. And then here he is calling. So he's saying, what can I do for you? Now, I thought maybe he could give us his name to a letter, a fundraising letter or something like that. He said, no, I want to do a show for you. Because I heard about this building. And he had also heard that we were not ones to complain. We didn't focus on what we didn't have. We focused on what we did have. And he liked that. And he said to the press many times that that's why he came. Because that's how he looked at it. And so I said, well, the theater's going to be built. We're expecting it to be open in the fall. But I don't know when, because they were supposed to open in this last one. I said, well, I want to do that thing. Andre Robinson at the time was my managing director. general manager. And so once Cosby and I were finished talking, Cosby's manager started talking to Andre. Somehow, turned out we ended up with Cosby doing 5 shows now. So the very first show was the first show at the new theater. And once everybody knew that Cosby was coming, that place you could not get a parking lot space because everything was taken up by carpenters and electricians and plumbers. Everybody said, we gotta get this ready. We got to.
Yeah.
And the we was, of course, the city and the cultural center. I mean, people wanted this ready. Cosby had never performed in New Jersey before, outside of Atlantic City.
Right.
So, and his show was the #1 hit show at the time on TV. So I mean, everybody was scrambling to get this going. So much so that by the time we did the ribbon cutting that night, the lobby was ready, the entrance was ready, the stairway I spoke of leading up to, that was ready, except please don't touch the railings, that that log, because they were sticky. That was it, nothing else was it. So Cosby's in his dressing room, which amounted to like this little, it was just not that back there. And then we did the ribbon cutting, then the audience came in. And then I think they were laying down carpet in the theater while the audience was in the reception. So finally we were able to open the doors, they came in, lights come up, and after Penelope Latimer and I do our thing and welcome everybody, here comes Cosby, and he comes out. And we're so proud because, everybody, it looks so beautiful. The first thing Cosby said was, man, it looks like Las Vegas out here. But it looks like Alabama back there.
That's funny.
But, when we moved to the other thing by that time, I was also becoming more involved nationally with the American theater. And so, and I think, by that time I might have been president of Theater Communications Group, which is the national service organization of theaters. And we were the first black theater to move to something like this. Not in the country, in the city, in the country. It also meant that we were moving to a different union status. We were going to become a LORT theater, which up to that point we were a developing theater.
So you have to pay a union scale when
We did before as well,
You did.
but they would cut us breaks. Now we were standard, so now we had to pay everybody union. And they didn't cut us as many breaks as they used to, and it was more expensive. The space was bigger, which meant that the sets needed to be bigger and all of this. And by this time, Andre Robinson had just burnt out. Just the idea of getting this
This
theater
was such
open.
a big operation.
Yes. So we started the search, and we did a national search for a managing director. And, over those years, it was very important, again, that we just try our best to get as many candidates who are people of color as possible. But it was through those years that we had to not only re-find ourselves as an organization, but also artistically in terms of the work. It was more expensive, and we were in a bigger space, but does that mean it needs to be bigger? Those were a lot of questions that we had
So
to ask
what
ourselves along the
what
way.
you would put on would be different just by the nature of the change in space?
Well, remember the post in the middle of the stage?
Yeah.
In the old theater? It was a Y beam, so it wasn't
we-
just something.
So you did something artistically with that.
With every play, you're right. Absolutely, with every play. And it was a Y beam, so it reached out and caused you to find another way. And so I believe that was part of our imagination and creativity at that time. It was finding the other way, finding a way to make it make sense. Well, now here we are in a theater where there is no why me. There is no obstacle. And it was a very, very interesting set of lessons we learned to try to figure out how to do our work in a space that has no obstacle. It's all yours. It's all, it's almost like, well, the rehearsal hall. In the old theater, we were in our offices writing, trying to get our work done, but at the same time, rehearsals going on, and every now and then we'll hear a scream or sing. And at first you say, oh, what happened? But then you realize, oh, we're just in rehearsal. And that was just the norm. It was just a normal thing. In the new space, we had doors. We had this. We had hallways. We had an airlock, sound lock. So, you kind of learn what you fill. How do you fill that space that was once filled by the funk of it all? There's a funkiness to the old space. Gradually, we in the new space, the interior designers are really into hard stuff, industrial, that sort of thing. So there was a lot of industrial stuff in the theater, but just metal here, metal there. And I remember one day just saying, I can't deal with this. So I remember starting to rip it down, and replace it with wood. Went out to Pier 1 and bought all this pottery and put it up, We then started to, Doug Hosney, by this time, was our production manager, who now runs one of the theaters in the Jazz at Lincoln Center for Wynton Marsalis. But he said, okay, because I wanted to create a marketplace. I never saw theater as something that just sits alone. I want it framed with a certain experience in the lobby. So a certain type of music, visual arts, paintings, bookstore, food. So that's what we had in the new theater to try to compensate. Work in a gallery, in a bookstore.
So it was personalizing.
It make it personalized, but also personalizing from a cultural point of view. So we would have our food rather than in only at a table. We were going around with baskets, African baskets, and that, and the pottery, and the music, and the artwork, and all of that, and literature made it work.
Some recollections on the Tony Award?
What's that?
On the Tony Award?
Yes.
Just some recollections of that?
Oh, I would say that I never thought that we would get something like that. I think that if our goal from the beginning was to create an important theater, we never would have gotten there. Because the best you could do is your best work on stage. And that's what we focused on, not trying to look at us as anything bigger than this. And that was okay. This is what we were. Recognition came, in many forms as we went along. But for some reason, I didn't think about the Tony until we were doing an August Wilson play, Jitney. The year before that, August Wilson spoke at the annual TCG conference in Princeton. And I was the president of the board at the time. So he gave the keynote address. It was in the Carter Theater stage, and I'm there sitting while he gives the speech, and it was an incredible landmark speech he gave. And I thought back to our first, maybe the second or third year of Crossroads, when we first heard about TCG and this annual conference. I don't think there's anything we wanted more than to be a part of the national community or the theater community, wherever it was. And it happened that that year the conference was at McCarter at Princeton. So I think that was around 1982. And we didn't have the money. Lee and I wanted to go, but we didn't have the funds to pay for the tuition. We called them, can we get a break? We're right here. They said, no, I can't. So we couldn't afford to go. And if that was in 1982, now we're talking 1997, 15 years later, and I'm on the stage of the same conference as the president, and this is August Wilson. That speech then led to a conversation August and I had where he said, look, Rick, what do you think about doing jitney at Crossroads? Because it had not come into New York. Everybody was doing August Wilson plays after it hit Broadway and all of this. I always wanted to do an August Wilson play before I went to New York. And so when he said that, it was just, oh man, that did it for me. That was a huge moment for me. And the speech he gave was also one that was quite controversial, and it led to a lot of discussions, conversations after that. Mainly because he was trying to say that the ground is not, the playing field is not equal. And black theater is alive and well in America, because it is in many places, but it's just not funded. So that upset the funders. He had issues about non-traditional casting, colorblind casting, and that upset the regional theaters. So now we're doing jitney at Crossroads. August was there. He was living in Colony House for a month while we developed this play. I remember him saying, I like New Brunswick, but I don't understand this cab thing. Get a cab and then they put other people in it too. That was the one thing he remembered.
Yeah.
That was one thing that he remembered. The one thing Bill Cosby remembered most about New Brunswick was how good the hamburger was at Tumulty's. That's what they remember there. So now we're doing jitney, and the National Critics Association decides that they're going to have, they meet regularly, I guess, and they wanted to know, can they meet at the matinee and jitney? I said, yeah. And then they did, and then after the matinee, they had box lunches and just found places to sit in our lobby. And shortly after that, we found out they were considering us for the Tony Award. And that was the first time I ever thought about it. But we didn't get it. We were on the short list. I said, do you realize how close you came? I said, no, not at all. And then at the end of that year, in the summer, we hold our staff retreats, and I would pull the staff together for 3 or 4 days at a time. And I decided to give them a really big idea. And I said, you know what? Let's get the Tony next year. Let's get it. Let's get it. And from that point on, I charged my staff with laying out a plan to get there. Now, of course, it's not about lobbying, and I wasn't speaking about that, or publicity. I was speaking about, all of this time, it's always been about doing our best work on stage. If we're going to really do it and get an award like that, that award is not just about our art, it's about the whole organization. So let's figure out a plan for how to do our best work in every office. Every office. And so we went through exercises called Model of Excellence. Like, how do we model that? How do we make excellence our goal, not only on stage, but in every other space? And if we do that, we're going to get this Tony. And we got the call, and we did. I guess the thing that I come out of that with is that everything is possible. And too often, there are too many children like me growing up in Philadelphia and Camden being told nothing that you want to do is possible. through guidance counselors
Mhm.
who steer you away from what you could really be. This happens today. Teachers, parents even say, you're nothing. You're not going to amount to nothing. No, and child looks around, and 9 times out of 10, that's what they see.
Mhm.
The Tony Award for me is not an award that comes when you don't do your work. It's the award that comes when you do your work, and you believe that if you do your work, good things will happen.
Mhm.
Regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your gender, regardless of your height, nationality, religion, do the work. Do the work. It's all about excellence. Roscoe Brown, original Tuskegee Airman, who was our main consultant on Fly.
Mhm.
He said, in the 40s, he had to face racism in the South. These guys were at the tops of their class in college to get in to this program, to learn how to fly a plane and then go overseas, 20,000 feet in the air, and you are up there and it's just you. And because they were so good, and they had such a success record at protecting the bomber pilots would come back to the United States and say, these were the ones, they're the ones we're alive, why we're alive today. But those same black pilots, they came back and they would tell the story about how they were on an aircraft carrier. They came into New York, or wherever they came in, and you come to the plank, you're with all the buddies, you've earned the right to be brothers, black and white. And there's a sign that says, white's that way, colored that way. And I would hear the stories about all of the stuff that would happen after that as well for years and years and years. And I asked Roscoe, if this country is going to do this against you after you've done this for them, why did you do it? Why would anybody do it? And he said, because as bad as racism was, fascism was worse. That's how they looked at it. So they had a global sense of things and a belief in their country, and therefore wanting to be part of that fight on behalf of their country and on behalf of victims all over the world. They wanted to be a part of this. And as for adversity that he dealt with, he said, and he says today, excellence, the pursuit of excellence is what conquers all adversity. And that to me is what I believe the Tony Award says about Crossroads. It's not a reflection that I have that, yes, it makes me feel really good and really proud. I'm also very glad that it makes so many other people, including my parents and family and everybody, very proud, and New Jersey and Brunswick. But what it really should say to people is that you must turn a blind eye to those who say, no, you can't, and go forward with the pursuit of excellence being your number one. And if you can do that, then you can get this.
And your thoughts on what you were and were not able to accomplish with the Crossroads sort of vision?
Yeah.
Both expanding to the minority community as well as opening the dialogue to a majority that may not have been exposed to apartheid and other, I mean, just some thoughts there and the difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely love the fact that we were able to create the type of American theater audience that no other theater has. In the very beginning, that was our goal. It's not like we wanted to do theater and then it was an afterthought to be diverse. No, that was an important part of the mission. We wanted people of all colors to see who we were. And as the years went on, my personal thing became more international, global, so that it was not just pursuit of the story, but to do the stories about here, but all over the world, not just black and white, but brown and tan and everything in between. I feel very good about that and the fact that we were able to create an audience that supported that. That's a beautiful thing. It's a kind of community that just doesn't exist anywhere else, and yet it only exists for the night, and then it goes away.
So there's 20/20 hindsight.
Well,
Anything
a lot.
we've done differently? Or
So much.
or of course.
So much.
I mean, we can, of course we do things differently. But just some,
I think, I think, of course, we tried very hard along the way to do the business end right. And I think sometimes we did get it right. And I think sometimes we didn't. And I think that what we were facing was harder for Crossroads in many ways than other theaters. In the early days, in the new building, everything was growing. New Jersey was growing. This black theater was growing. Theater in general was growing. Governor Kane said, "I want to be second to none." And so the goal was, through the Arts Council, let's make sure that the arts is that way throughout New Jersey. And so we were really building along with everybody else. There was an enthusiasm, and along with that enthusiasm came money. We got to the point where our annual, grant from the State Arts Council was $300,000, but we got an additional $300,000 a year because we were a major impact organization, and they were funding the extraordinary. Like, what do you want to do that's extraordinary? And so we said, look, we want to make sure that we're creating new works, but we also want to make sure that we're partners and producers in the future of that work in New York. And we did the Colored Museum on TV, and it was the State Arts Council that was backing that, and NJN, and all of this stuff was happening at the time. We learned how to grow. Then came adversity that everybody experienced. The economy started getting crazy. We had been very successful in a fundraising campaign at Crossroads so that we would be able to, I think we had something like $50,000 debt. We wanted to wipe that out. We wanted to expand our staff to include business people, general manager, fundraising people, and we did that with that grant. Ford Foundation supported that in a great way. And then we wanted to have a cash reserve because we didn't know what we were going to expect going into the new building. No one can tell us what the rent was going to be. No one can tell us what the expenses were going to be. People just didn't know. They were all good-minded people. They just didn't know. When we ended up raising that money, we had about $400,000 there in the bank in case something went wrong, or whatever, just in case. It probably could have eventually built to an endowment, which would have been great. But that year was the first major cut of the Arts Council. And everybody was cut in half.
When would that have been?
In 90.
Okay.
In 1990, everybody was cut in half. So that the 90-91 season at Crossroads was our last season in the old space. But we had $300,000 less to have to work with. And that ate into that reserve a lot. When we moved into the new theater, we didn't have a reserve, we didn't have a long-range plan, we didn't have a lot of stuff. And it was what somebody called the perfect storm. We moved into a building that was far more expensive, and we had to pay for all of it.
Yeah.
At the same time, we were losing $300,000 a year from the Arts Council. And the economy was
Yeah.
starting to go down.
Right.
So all of this stuff was happening, and Crossroads did not know. We didn't know how to change the way we really could have. In hindsight, I remember Christine Vincent from the Ford Foundation saying, Rick, now by this time, we didn't have a debt, but by the time we got to the end of the second year of the new theater, we were in debt by we had lost $600,000 in just that 1 year.
Yeah.
And the reason that we didn't lose as much in the first year was because of Cosby. Because when Cosby came, if it was just about the benefit, that'd be one thing. But he said, no, I'll do 4 performances at the State Theater also. And the state was very supportive of that. And those shows allowed me to get all of our subscribers in.
I see.
So it took the place of a production. So it was in the second year that we really started to feel the effects. And we didn't know what to do. We tried our best. Christine said, I wish you could just get down to $2 million, because we were at about $3 million right there. We had 3,300 members, subscribers. We were doing really well, but we weren't making ends meet because the building was all electric.
Yeah.
And because we had to pay, George C. Playhouse, Eric will tell you, was given a reprieve for the first 5 years, I think, where they didn't have to pay any of that stuff, or first 10 years. But I think part of that was also because they had owned the building before that, so that was part of the deal. We didn't have anything. Once we hit the ground, we had to pay rent. We had to pay, even though the building was paid for by Anna Ashkenaz already by the county. It was paid for. We still had to pay rent. We had to pay utilities. We had to pay our cleaning. We had to pay all of these things. And I remember the first year, Emily Mann, who was a friend of mine at that time, was coming into the Ricardo Theater. She called me one day. She said, Rick, you're not going to believe this. I have a gardener. The thing about McCarter and American Repertory Theater and Yale Rep and places that are important in this country, they have their angels. They're protected by a university there who handles everything. Those who have endowments are protected. Those who have live in very wealthy areas like Wilbur are protected. Crossroads had no protection. And in hindsight, I wish we had created an endowment very early on. Crossroads also, as we developed our funding, I told you as everything was growing, the pattern we were growing into was such that we were getting a lot of contributed income. In the mainstream, in the American theater, most of the contributed income comes from individuals for a mainstream theater. Under that, the next is corporations, then foundations, and then at the very lowest is government. Crossroads, by the time we moved into the new theater, had developed a pattern that was the exact opposite. Individuals was very low, government was the highest, then foundations, and then corporations. And it was all because they were rewarding us for what we did. But what we weren't doing at the same time was developing the type of individual support that could have made us stronger enough to sustain problems.
Right.
So that the government, or when foundations change their, what they want to do, their agenda. We also did not have a kind of board. We didn't have CEOs on our board. We had maybe the second in command or the third or fourth in command. So when we came to a board meeting and said, look, here's the issue, here's the problem, they couldn't solve it there at the table. They would have to say, okay, I'll have to go back.
Yeah.
So culture we created was always, not always, but, you know, once we got into the new theater, it was not a problem, we could not solve the problems. And in hindsight, I would have figured out a way to cut that budget of expenses so drastically, because the one thing that we do have control over is what you spend. But then I have my heart.
I'd be in.
And the problem with my heart was that all of those staff members who were part of making it possible for us to get there, I would have to cut half of that. How do I do that?
We're gonna run out here a minute.
Yeah.
I would be interested a little bit more in your decision to stay in New Brunswick and how you felt the theater contributed to or didn't to the redevelopment in New Brunswick. Because the
Staying
time you
in New
decided,
Brunswick.
yeah, you decided after college, MFA, you wanted to start the
It was
theater.
natural.
Okay.
I mean, coming out of school,
Right,
I was 4 years at Rutgers, and then 4 years at Mason Gross. All my friends were there. There was a theater there, professional theater. There was a state theater where I saw the Albinelli company. You know, there were so many things happening.
okay.
I think at that time, New Brunswick clearly was on the up, you know, just
Yes.
on the way up. And because J&J had decided to stay,
Okay.
that was a big message sent to us. There was New Brunswick Tomorrow there, and there were people like Roy Epps who were trying to start things, and Penelope Latimer trying to start things, John Heldridge trying to make things happen. There were visionaries, and there was Eric Krebs and John Bettenbender, and I was there, and we just felt like we could do this. So there was never a decision to stay.
Right, I see, okay.
It just was a natural flow.
And your thoughts about the redevelopment in New Brunswick was very clearly, a lot of what was there was not
There was,
bad.
I think with all redevelopment, there's a dislocation. And I saw that neighborhood I was describing earlier, I saw that go away. The neighborhood was made up of blacks and whites and Dominicans and straight and gay and just you could walk 3 blocks in a 2-block distance walk. You would pass at least 5 different types of music. I loved that. It was not the nicest neighborhood to look at. So with the revitalization, I am very, very, grateful for the fact that they saw the arts as an important part of that. When restaurants came along, of course, it also caused rents to go up, not in New Brunswick, but in other cities where the theaters were used. And then the rents went up because the restaurant moved in because of the theater. It didn't happen in New Brunswick to us because we were part of the cultural center. But if you weren't part of the cultural center, I think it made it harder to become an arts organization. So, I also have always felt that the cultural center should not just be about this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing. But if there are 4 arts groups that are part of the cultural center, then those are 4 missions. But there should be a 5th. The 5th should be about what all of us mean to each other. And as of today, I don't think we've gotten there.
I was actually wearing my Professor Urban Planning hat. You really don't see in the United States where the redevelopment has occurred without the displacement.
Yeah. Right.
Lincoln Center, I mean, it's.
Oh my God.
It's almost, maybe 1 or 2 outlier examples, but, so you would say, what was the national policy? What were planners doing in this? And there wasn't participation of the indigenous communities. They were displaced. There was very little with no safety net, etc.
Which is why I say dislocate,
Yeah,
because because you're not whole
Yeah.
after that. You move, but you're not whole. The community wasn't there to spread out. You know, when we spread out the projects, the homes, the budget, you know, they're all dislocated. But at the same time, I think that cement is a big problem for anyway. So, you know, I'm glad those homes aren't there. I'm glad that what was replacing them were two-story homes and three-story places where people could actually have a garden. There's so many things that I think have been very positive about the things that happen in New Brunswick. And the arts is, I think, a part of it.
Thank you so much. This has been
As you could
moving
tell,
and
I could probably talk
informative,
forever, I guess.
and
we went for 2 hours, this is probably our longest.
Oh, really?
We are in your debt.
And we just
Yeah.
scratched the surface.
I know.
Yeah.
And you'll see in our write-up how little there was in Crossroads. Now,
Yes.
I was saying, we can't talk about what happened in New Brunswick with sort of getting it third hand or second hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Yes.
You're welcome. It was a
Great.
pleasure. It was an honor to do it.
Great.
Yeah. It's a couple of our really important friends, Ruby Diaz and Davis, huge supporters of Crossroads, and you know, you just watch. There's certain people like that, and like my parents. You know, you look at them and you see how they go through life and what means so much to them. Which is, you know, from them I get, no, this is not me doing a favor. This is part of my responsibility, and that I'm grateful for that.
That's great.
So one of my first research projects at Rutgers was in Camden. So we went to, we were looking at, in North Camden, there was a major effort. It was called CHIP, Camden Housing Improvement Project.
Yes.
Where they rehabilitated like 500 homes, etc. Camden challenges what